The signal stopped on a Tuesday. For the Coalition observer fleet drifting beyond the Uit boundary, this was the first thing that did not make sense. Not the humans, not yet. The signal. For 63 years, Earth had leaked radio into the dark like a womb that would not clot, chatter, music, weather reports, the endless argument of a species that could not stop talking. The Coalition had mapped it, cataloged it, used it to estimate population, technology tier, and threat ceiling. The estimate had been comforting, Tier 4, pre-singularity, loud, primitive, contained. Then, 11 hours before the Erasure Armada was scheduled to translate into the Sol system, the noise stopped. Not faded, not encrypted, stopped. All of it, across every band in the same instant, as though a planet of 9 billion had simultaneously decided to hold its breath. Sub-Coordinator Vestal of the Thren studied the silence on his readouts and felt something he had no word for in his own language, because the Thren had eliminated that emotion from their genome 40,000 years ago. It would take him a long time to learn the human word for it. The word was dread. He told no one. That was his first mistake, though he would not understand it as a mistake until much later, when there was very little of him left to do the understanding. The Armada was not subtle. It was never meant to be. 240 vessels of the Concordant Reclamation Authority, each one older than human agriculture, crewed by 7 species who had long ago agreed on the single principle that bound the civilized galaxy together. That a world which had not yet achieved the quietude, the disciplined silencing of the self, the surrender of individual will to collective survival, was a world that could not be trusted with the dark between stars. Earth had been flagged for reclamation not because it was dangerous, but because it was noisy in a way the Coalition found ominous. Loud species, the history said, were unstable. Unstable species, given enough time, reached the dark, and the dark did not forgive instability. So the order was simple: translate in, sterilize the surface, leave the biosphere recoverable for later seeding, erase the noise. 12 hours start to finish. The reclamation had done this 14 times before, and 14 times the worlds had screamed and burned and gone quiet, and the galaxy had remained safe. The Armada translated into Sol at the edge of the Kuiper field, expecting to find a planet praying. It found a message instead. The message was waiting for them, not broadcast but placed, set carefully in the path of their arrival like a stone laid on a road. It was etched into the hull of a derelict probe, one of humanity's own ancient machines, a thing of gold plates and primitive isotopes that the Coalition's archives identified as a relic from before Earth could even leave its own gravity well. The probe had been moved, dragged from the deep dark where it had been drifting for a century, and positioned exactly where the Armada's lead vessel would see it first. On its surface, scratched in a hand that the translators struggled to parse because it was not transmitted in any standard frequency but simply carved, were 4 words in one of Earth's dead trade languages. "We know you're coming." Vestal read the translation 3 times. The other coordinators dismissed it. "A bluff," said the Vor tactician. "A primitive superstition. How could a Tier 4 world know? They had given no warning. The translation corridors were sealed." The Armada's approach had been silent for a full cycle, but Vestal kept returning to the silence 11 hours before arrival, the held breath. He could not stop thinking that a species does not stop screaming unless it has decided that screaming is no longer useful. And there were only 2 reasons a thing stopped screaming. Either it had given up, or it had begun to listen for something. He did not say this aloud. That was his second mistake. The Armada advanced. They expected resistance at the outer planets, orbital platforms, mass drivers, the desperate flailing of a cornered civilization. There was nothing. They passed the ring giant. Nothing. They passed the red world that the archives noted humans had touched but not held. Nothing. The closer they came to Earth, the quieter the system became, and the quiet was worse than any defense could have been, because every coordinator aboard those 240 ships had expected the noise, and the absence of it began slowly to do something to them that no weapon could have done. It made them wonder what the humans were waiting for. By the time the Armada reached Earth orbit, 3 vessels had reported equipment malfunctions, sensor ghosts, contacts that appeared and vanished. The Vor tactician called it interference from the planet's magnetosphere. Vestal pulled the raw data and found that the ghosts were not random. They were following the fleet, pacing it, always at the edge of detection, always sliding away when a ship turned its full attention toward them, like something that did not want to be seen yet but did want to be counted. He counted them. There were 40. He did not know what they were. He would not know for a long time. This is the first thing you must understand about what happened at Earth. The humans never explained. They simply did and let the galaxy assemble the meaning afterward from the wreckage, and the meaning was always worse than the act. Earth, seen from orbit, was beautiful and undefended. The cities glowed. There were no shields, no fleets, no orbital guns. The reclamation coordinators relaxed, because a planet that does not defend itself is a planet that has accepted death, and accepted death is easy. The order to begin sterilization was given, and nothing happened, not because the weapons failed. The weapons fired. The vast thermal lances of the lead vessels charged and discharged and reached toward the surface and stopped. 300 kilometers above the cities, the beams simply ended, scattered into harmless light against something that was not a shield, because the coalition knew what shields looked like, and this was not that. This was geometry. The space above Earth had been seeded with something, millions of objects, each one tiny, each one almost nothing, drifting in patterns too complex to be natural and too cheap to be advanced. Debris. The humans had filled their own orbit with garbage, decades of it. Spent rockets, dead satellites, fragments of fragments, and somewhere in that cloud, threaded through it, were mirrors and chaff and things that bent and scattered and ate energy, and the thermal lances of the reclamation armada, weapons designed to crack continents, dissolved uselessly against a wall of trash that a Tier 4 civilization had spent 40 years building without anyone in the galaxy understanding why. The archives had noted it. Orbital pollution. A primitive's carelessness. A species too disorganized to clean up after itself. Vestal understood in that moment that it had never been carelessness. The humans had been building this for decades. They had known, somehow, longer than anyone imagined, that the dark was watching them. And instead of begging the galaxy for mercy, instead of joining the quietude, instead of doing any of the rational things a cornered species does, they had quietly, patiently, for 2 human generations, been turning the sky over their own heads into a coffin lid. This was the first time the coalition was catastrophically wrong about humanity. It would not be the last. The Vor tactician was not impressed. A defensive screen, he said. Clever, but defensive. Defense delays death. It does not prevent it. He ordered the Armada to descend below the debris layer into atmosphere, where their weapons would have clean lines to the surface and the trash above would be useless. 40 vessels broke formation and dropped toward the clouds. This, too, was what the humans had planned, though no one would understand that until the ships began to fall. They did not fall to weapons. That was the horror of it. The first vessel to enter the upper atmosphere reported all systems nominal, target acquisition green, and then reported that it could not find the ground. Its sensors, perfect sensors, sensors that could count the moons of a gas giant from another system, told it that the surface of Earth was at 4 different altitudes simultaneously. The ship's automated systems, trusting the sensors as they had been built to do for 10,000 years, attempted to correct, and in correcting, flew into a mountain. The humans had not jammed the sensors. They had done something stranger. They had spent the decades since they first detected the coalition's distant surveys, And this is the part that made Vestal's blood run cold when he finally pieced it together, learning how coalition sensors worked. Not by stealing the technology. They could not have understood the technology. They had simply listened to the surveys, the faint probing scans that passed over Earth every few years, and they had reverse-engineered not the machines but the assumptions. They had learned what the machines expected to see. And then they had built a world that lied in exactly the language the machines spoke. Decoy heat signatures, false terrain returns, entire phantom cities radiating convincing thermal profiles in empty deserts while the real cities went dark and cold and silent. The humans had turned their entire planet into a single enormous deception aimed at a specific audience, and the audience had arrived precisely on schedule, and the trap had been built years before the trappers knew the date. 11 vessels were lost in the first hour. Not destroyed, lost. Flown into oceans, into mountains, into each other. The Vor tactician, who had begun the day with contempt, ended the first hour with something closer to nausea, because his ships were dying and there was no enemy to fire upon. The humans had not fired a single shot. And here Vestal made an observation that he reported up the chain, and that the chain dismissed, and that would later be carved into the founding charter of 3 separate civilizations, as the moment the galaxy should have turned its armada around and fled. He observed that the humans were not trying to win. The math was simple: 40 phantom defenses, 11 kills against 240 vessels. At that rate the humans would exhaust their tricks long before the Armada exhausted its ships. Any rational species, having sprung its best traps and seen them only delay the inevitable, would now negotiate or surrender or die. That was the shape of every reclamation. The clever ones bought themselves a few hours of dignity and then accepted the quietude. But the humans, Vestal saw, were not buying time to surrender. They were buying time. Full stop, as though time itself were the weapon, and every hour they stole from the Armada was an hour spent waiting for something. He returned again and again to the silence 11 hours before arrival, the held breath. A species does not stop screaming to surrender. It stops screaming to listen. What, he asked the Council of Coordinators, are they listening for? No one answered, because no one had thought to ask what the humans had been doing in the deep dark beyond the planet, in the cold places past the Uit cloud where the Armada had passed without looking, because there was nothing out there worth looking at. Nothing but the 40 sensor ghosts that had paced the fleet inward. Nothing but the dark. This is the second thing you must understand. The galaxy had spent its entire history afraid that loud species would one day reach the dark and find something terrible there. The Coalition's whole philosophy, the quietude, the reclamations, all of it, was built on that single ancient fear, that the dark between stars held things best left undisturbed, and that an undisciplined species would wake them. The Coalition had never once considered that a species might reach the dark and become the terrible thing itself. The humans had been out there for a long time, longer than their radio noise suggested. The noise, Vestal would eventually realize, had been part of the lie too, a loud, primitive, comforting noise broadcast deliberately to make the galaxy underestimate a species that had, in absolute silence, been seeding the deep dark with something for over a century. He learned the name of it from a prisoner. There was only one human prisoner ever taken in the battle for Earth, and her name was Commander Adiz Akoro, and she was taken because she allowed herself to be taken. And that decision was the single most important thing any human did in the entire war, though no one, not Vestal, not the Council, not Akoro herself in the beginning, understood why. She was found in a disabled escape pod drifting near the wreck of the 11th down vessel. Alive. Conscious. Uninjured in a way that the medical scans found suspicious, because the pod had taken damage that should have killed her, and she sat in the center of it with her hands folded and her eyes open, waiting, the way the whole planet had waited. And when the Thren retrieval team brought her aboard Vestal's vessel, she looked at the sub-coordinator with an expression he could not read and said, in a coalition trade tongue she should not have known, "You came 11 hours early." The room went cold. The Armada's schedule was the most protected secret in the operation. She could not have known the arrival time, let alone that they had pushed it forward 11 hours to catch the planet off guard. "How?" Vestal asked. "Do you know that?" And Akoro smiled, and it was not a triumphant smile. It was a tired one, the smile of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and is almost able to set it down. "Because 11 hours ago," she said, "we stopped talking. And you came anyway, which means you'd already left, which means everything we sent into the dark 4 years ago arrived too early too." She closed her eyes. "We were hoping for more time. We always hope for more time. We never get it, but we go anyway." She would not explain what she had sent into the dark. Not then. That was the human advantage that the coalition would spend the rest of the war failing to comprehend. Humans understood instinctively, in a way no quietude species ever could, that the most powerful thing you can give an enemy is an unanswered question, because a frightened mind will fill the silence with horrors far worse than anything you could actually deploy. Akoro gave them the silence. She let them fill it. By the 6th hour of the battle, the Armada had lost 31 vessels and destroyed 11 phantom cities and killed perhaps 400,000 humans in the regions where the deceptions failed, and the survivors of those regions did not flee. This was the third catastrophic misunderstanding, and it broke something in the Vor tactician that never healed. When the bombardment finally reached real population, when the lances finally found real cities full of real people, the people did not run. They climbed onto rooftops. They lit fires, not signal fires for rescue. There was no rescue. They lit fires so that the descending reclamation vessels would have clean targets, so that the ships would commit to attack runs over the burning cities, so that the ships would fly low and slow and predictable, into the corridors where the humans had hidden their only real weapons, not energy lances, not warships, but mass. Old, stupid, primitive mass. Rail-launched tungsten, steel and gravity. Cities full of people turning themselves into bait so that a falling rod of metal could find the throat of a vessel that had crossed the galaxy to kill them. The Vor tactician watched a human city burn and saw, on his sensors, the population density readings, and saw that the humans were moving toward the fires, not away. And he asked the question that every quietude species eventually asks about humanity and never survives the answer to. Why are they not afraid to die? And Akoro, listening from her cell through a translation feed the Thren did not know she had compromised, answered him though he could not hear her. "We're terrified to die," she said quietly to no one. "That's the part you'll never understand. We're not brave. We're the most frightened species you've ever met. We just learned a long time ago that being afraid and stopping are different things." Here the story turns, and everything before it changes meaning. In the 8th hour, the 40 sensor ghosts that had paced the Armada from the outer system finally resolved. They had been falling inward the entire time, slow and patient, masked by the chaos of the battle, and now they arrived, and the Coalition saw them clearly for the first time, and the Coalition did not understand what it was seeing. And this is the moment the war was already over, 4 hours before anyone in the Armada realized it. They were human ships, but they were wrong. They were old. Centuries old, by the wear on their hulls, far older than any vessel humanity should have been able to build given the technology tier the Coalition had assigned them. They were enormous, slow, ugly, and they were not armed in any way the sensors could identify, and they did not move like warships. They moved like things that had been traveling for a very long time and had forgotten how to do anything else. And they were broadcasting, finally, after a century of silence, and what they broadcast was not a weapon and not a threat but a sound, a single human sound, repeated, that the translators rendered and then refused to believe. It was a heartbeat, slowed almost to stopping, the heartbeat of something asleep. Akoro heard it through the feed, and she began, very quietly, to weep, and Vestal, who had been watching her because he had begun to understand that she was the only instrument aboard his ship that could read the situation accurately, asked her what the ships were. And she told him, finally, because it no longer mattered, because the thing was already done. 112 years ago, she said, we found one of your survey probes, a dead one. We took it apart. We learned that you were out there, and we learned what you did to noisy worlds, and we learned that you were afraid of the dark. She wiped her face. So we did the thing your whole civilization is built around preventing. We went into the dark. We sent ships, slow ships, the only kind we had, generation ships, full of people who knew they would die out there, and that their grandchildren would die out there, and that maybe, their grandchildren's grandchildren would arrive at the place we sent them. We didn't send them to settle, we sent them to wait, to sleep in the cold past the edge of everything and wait for the day you came for us. We sent 40 of them. We didn't know if any would survive. We never heard from them again. For 112 years we assumed they died in the dark, every one, and we kept building the traps here at home because the ships in the dark were a prayer, and you do not bet a planet on a prayer. She looked at the heartbeat on the display. But they didn't die, she whispered. They got there. They've been out there in the cold for a century, sleeping, waiting, becoming something we don't have a word for anymore. And 11 hours ago when we went silent, that was the signal. The only signal that could reach the dark, the absence of us. We told them if Earth ever goes quiet, it means they've come. Wake up, come home. The Vortactician, listening now, demanded to know what the ships could possibly do. 40 unarmed derelicts, slow, ancient. No weapons. The Armada still had 200 vessels. What threat was a heartbeat? And this is the answer that ended the quietude forever, the answer that 3 civilizations would carve into stone, the answer that made the galaxy stop sending armadas and start sending diplomats. The human ships had no weapons because the human ships were the weapons. A century in the deep dark with nothing to build with but their own dead. The descendants aboard those generation ships had run out of metal, out of fuel, out of everything, except people and time, and the one thing humans never run out of, which is the refusal to simply stop. They had not survived the dark. They had adapted to it. They had spent 100 years becoming things that could live in the cold between stars without ships, and the ships were only cocoons now, only shells. And when the heartbeat reached its final slowed beat, the 40 hulls opened, all at once. And what came out of them the coalition sensors could not measure, because the sensors had been built by a species that silenced itself. And the things that came out of the human ships had spent a century doing the opposite. Screaming into the dark until the dark learned to scream back, until they were no longer entirely the children who had been sent, but something the dark had answered. The coalition had feared, for 40,000 years, that a loud species would reach the dark and wake something terrible. They had simply never imagined the something terrible would be the species. The Armada did not survive the 9th hour. I will not describe what the returned children did to it, because the survivors who saw it could not describe it either, and the ones who tried did not remain survivors for long. I will only tell you that it was quiet, that the most frightening thing about it, the thing the Vortactician said again and again in the inquiry before he removed himself from existence, was that it was quiet. The humans who came back from the dark made no sound at all. After a century of screaming, they had finally learned the quietude, and they had learned it better than the species that invented it, and they turned it on the Armada like a blade. Vestal survived because Akoro saved him. This is the part that no quietude species has ever been able to forgive, because it is the part that proves humanity was never the monster they needed it to be, which is somehow worse. When the children came, Akoro broke from her cell. She had compromised it hours ago and simply chosen to stay. And she came to the bridge where Vestal stood frozen before the displays, and she took his arm, this creature he had been about to help erase, and she pulled him toward the escape pods, and he asked her, because he could not understand, he could not make it make sense, why. Because someone has to tell them, she said. Someone has to go back to your council and tell them what's out there now. Not to threaten them, to warn them. She pushed him into the pod. Her hands were shaking. He realized she was, exactly as she had said, terrified, had been terrified the entire time, every hour, every choice. The bravery had never been the absence of fear. It had been the fear, carried forward anyway, for a century by people who would never see the end of it. We didn't want this, she said through the closing hatch. We never wanted the dark. We just wanted to live, and you wouldn't let us, and so we went out there and we paid for it. We paid more than you can imagine. We sent our own children to die in the cold so that the ones who came after might come home as something that could protect us. Do you understand what that costs? Do you understand what we lost to win this? She stepped back from the pod. There are more of us out there now, she said. Not 40. 40 was the beginning. We've been sending ships into the dark every year for 100 years. They're all still going. They're all still waiting. And every single one of them knows that the day Earth goes silent is the day they come home. Her face, in the last instant before the hatch sealed, was not triumphant and not cruel. It was grieving. Tell your council to never make us go quiet again. Not because we'll win. We'll win. Tell them because every time we win, we lose a little more of the part of us that wanted to lose. And one day there won't be any of that part left. And on that day the dark will have children with no reason left to come home. The pod launched. Vestal looked back once at the dying Armada and the silent things moving through it, and he understood, finally, the emotion that the Thren had bred out of themselves 40,000 years ago, the one he'd felt at the very beginning when the signal stopped. It was not fear. Fear was simpler. What he felt was the specific horror of having been comforted by a lie, the lie that the universe was rational, that strength was measured in technology and discipline, and the silencing of the self. He had believed that the strongest thing a species could do was master its own will. He understood now that he had met something stronger. He had met a species that had looked at extinction and at the dark and at the cost of survival and had said, with full knowledge of the price, again and again, across 100 years and 100 ships and uncountable graves in the cold between stars, we will continue, not because we can, because stopping is the one thing we never learned how to do. He carried the warning back. The council heard it. The reclamation stopped. The quietude, 40,000 years old, began to crack, because a philosophy built on the fear of waking something in the dark cannot survive the knowledge that the something is awake, and remembers who sent it there, and is patient and is still, even now, sending more of itself outward every year into the cold to sleep and to wait. Vestal lived a long time after that. He spent the rest of his life studying humanity, trying to find the bottom of them, the limit, the place where their persistence finally ran out. He never found it. He interviewed survivors and refugees and diplomats and soldiers, and he asked all of them the same question that the Vor tactician had asked in the 8th hour, and he received in 100 different forms the same answer until he finally understood it. He had asked, "Why are you not afraid to die?" And the answer was always, "We are." We always were. We are the most frightened species you will ever meet. We are afraid of the dark and the cold and the silence and the dying, all of it, every one of us, every hour. We feel all of it. We never stopped feeling it. We just kept going. And in his last years, when Vestal was old and the galaxy had changed, and no one sent armadas anymore, he would sometimes go out to the observation deck of the station where he lived and look toward the human worlds, and past them, into the deep dark beyond the edge of everything, where the cold things slept and waited and dreamed in a language the galaxy would never learn to speak. And he would think about Akaro, who had been terrified, and who had saved him, and who had gone back down to a burning planet to be with her people, because that was the one direction a human would always choose. And he would think about the ship still going outward, even now, full of children who knew they would die in the cold so that something might come home. And he understood at the end, the thing the galaxy had gotten wrong from the very first carved message floating in the dark. They had thought the words were a threat. "We know you're coming." They were not a threat. They were an apology, because the humans had known even then, even at the beginning, that they would survive. They always survived. That was never the question. The question was what would be left of them each time they did, and how much they would have to send into the dark to do it, and whether the dark would keep sending it back, and for how long, and at what cost, until the only thing left of humanity was the part that could no longer stop. The galaxy is very quiet now. It learned the quietude from the species that taught the dark to scream. And on the worlds of men, every few years, a slow ship rises and turns its face to the cold and goes out, and no one waves and no one cheers, and the people on the ground do the only thing left to do, the thing they have always done, the thing the galaxy will never understand and will never stop fearing. They go silent, and they listen. And somewhere out past the edge of everything, in the dark that was never empty and is so much less empty now, something that used to be human opens one eye in the cold and waits to hear the silence that means it is time, at last, to come home.